My name is Peggy LaPointe, and this is Talking Trash, a Green Tips podcast. A chance for me to dive into the world of environmental issues by talking to people in business, government, and nonprofits, folks knee-deep in the field of sustainability. Episode 59 features Amanda Watson, Senior Policy Advisor for Portland Mayor Ted Wheeler. I subscribe to the BPS newsletter, and so when I saw this declaration, or the draft of the declaration, I looked over it and I'm like, okay, I got to get somebody to talk about it because A, I want to understand it more, and B, the city is looking for input from residents because, they want to hear feedback from all of us. So I thought, what if I can get somebody on to talk about it before the comment period is over? And thank you, Amanda, for coming in.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm really glad that you reached out and that we do have this opportunity to talk about the declaration.
So the big question is, what is the declaration? Just give listeners an idea of what the declaration is and what the intent from the mayor's office was when putting this together.
Yes, of course. So climate emergency declarations are not new. There's actually probably about 1,000 cities, or actually over 1,000 cities around the world that have declared climate emergencies. And so this is something that local environmental groups, climate activists have been kind of asking and in some cases demanding the city do for quite some time. And so this, came onto Mayor Wheeler and the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability's radar, last year, and they started some work on this. And for cities in general, it's a way to recognize that climate change is a really urgent issue, and we are at a turning point where we need to take more action now to avoid, the most catastrophic impacts of climate change. So I'm sure that you and listeners, are familiar with the reporting that's coming out on climate change and the IPCC's report around really 2020 is a critical year of action for us to bend the curve and meet our emission reduction goals. And so, first and foremost, what climate emergency declarations do and what the city of Portland does is to recognize that we're in a climate emergency. So we're already facing the impacts of climate change, right, both in Portland and around the world, and we need to do more to address it. A lot of cities have adopted climate emergency declarations as kind of a symbolic gesture, a gesture of solidarity, of recognition. And Portland has been working on addressing climate change for over 25 years. And, it's always been a critical issue for us and a very important thing for our community. And so in declaring a climate emergency declaration here in Portland, we wanted to also do something different and make it very meaningful. And so, the other kind of things that this climate emergency declaration does is it recognizes that climate change doesn't impact us all equally, right? And that recognizes that frontline communities in Portland and around the world are impacted worse by climate change, and our actions need to center them. And so this declaration outlines a new approach, kind of a pivot in the way that Portland is addressing climate action and will be doing so going forward. That's really centering those communities that are impacted most by climate change. It also outlines key, priority areas for action for the city, which, have been and will continue to be focused on, buildings and transportation sectors as the kind of top emitting sectors for Portland and largest contributors to local carbon emissions. And then, finally, in recognition of the climate emergency and kind of this need for urgent action, it updates the city's emission reduction goals. And so the target is reducing carbon emissions 50% below 1990 levels by 2030. So really in the next decade.
Pretty aggressive.
Yes. And then a goal of net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And this is in alignment with what, a lot of cities are doing around the world, alignment with the Paris Agreement.
Right. Well, and it was in October, you mentioned this, you touched upon it, that the mayor, after hearing concerns from youth and other community members, he went to the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability to work with groups, work with residents, city bureaus, partner agencies to get feedback. Generally speaking, what were some of the, how did that process look when he reached out, when he said, BPS, please look into this?
Yeah, so BPS staff started with some of the folks that have been the most vocal activists or vocal voices, right, and advocates for the climate emergency declaration, particularly, but also the people that had been asking, when BPS first started working on a climate emergency declaration, a lot of it was looking internally, what can the city do, pulling together kind of specific actions that bureaus had identified that could kind of help us to meet our more ambitious carbon emission reduction goals. But the community members were saying, we want to be more involved, right? And so they turned to these groups first. And so, those included engaging with frontline community-facing organizations, and that was largely through the Portland Clean Energy Fund Coalition and those groups. Youth-centered organizations were also a big part of that engagement. So groups like Sunrise Movement, PDX, you're probably familiar with, and then a handful of other organizations from environmental justice and social justice groups. And then, the engagement did continue to involve city bureaus that work on climate action. So both BPS, but also the Bureau of Transportation, climate scientists at Bureau of Environmental Services, and the Water Bureau, and then our partner agencies like Multnomah County. So more broad engagement was really the goal of slowing down that process, getting more feedback on what should be included in our climate emergency declaration.
It's pretty broad. I will have a link to the City of Portland's website right under where you find this podcast, this particular episode, on our website, king.fm. So you can go there and you can see the resolutions and the draft, and it'll also include a link to comment, because the comment period ends March 16th. And it's really, I think it's really important for folks to look this over, give feedback. Help direct where the city, is focused, because that's the more people who are responding, then the more communities and more things being taken into consideration for this.
Exactly.
So it's a better process when more people are engaged. This is a conversation that has been coming up a lot as far as frontline communities, both in Portland and worldwide, when it comes to climate change. These are the folks, Black and Indigenous groups, people, communities of colors, immigrants, refugees, low income individuals, people working with disabilities. They're often communities that are least responsible for climate change, for lack of a more specific way to say that, but yet they are disproportionately more affected by these things. And so I think having that be right at the top of the resolution is really important. So can you talk a little bit about that focus? And I think it's really great for here I am presenting as a white woman, married, 2 kids, living in Southeast Portland. It's important for all of us to hear why this is so critical.
Right. Yeah, and thank you for that. I think that is, it's a key part of what we're trying to do with the Climate Emergency Declaration. It is recognize the importance of centering frontline communities in our solutions, both, because these are the communities in Portland and elsewhere that historically haven't been able to benefit from our climate investments, right? So things like, energy efficiency incentives, or, installing solar panels on homes. A lot of those, are not accessible to folks who are renters, for example. So low-income communities have challenges there. We've seen underinvestment in parts of our city in terms of transportation infrastructure or tree canopy. And so as a result, we're seeing that communities of color and low-income communities in Portland have, greater health impacts from, air pollution, urban heat island effect, and things like this, right? So it's a recognition of the need to both develop solutions that are centering benefits for these communities, right? That while, reducing carbon emissions, but also expanding the table for planning, climate action planning, and bringing these voices and these communities and these people to the table who haven't historically been a part of that process. And I think the Portland Clean Energy Fund really brought that to a forefront in Portland, right?
Absolutely.
And another part of it is there is real leadership from frontline communities, from communities of color on climate change, and we also wanted to honor that and recognize that in this resolution, and commit as a city to supporting and partnering the priorities and the leadership that's already there.
Well, there are important voices all around the community that don't often get heard, and they definitely need to be a part of this. There are, just so people know, there are all the way to Q when it comes to resolutions, and I just highlighted a few of these. because they were things that stood out to me. Some of the other things that you also mentioned, the frontline communities having the least opportunities to benefit from it. And it was, I think, with the folks in the Portland Clean Energy Fund that I talked about, we talked about even the tree canopy. Trees aren't just for beauty. They are for so much more when it comes to helping to fight climate change. But some of the other aspects of this, whereas mitigating the climate emergency equitable requires transitioning from fossil fuels to clean, renewable energy system. That was something, again, that was pointed out as being important. I'm not going to go down each of these, but two stood out. And again, you touched upon it, the carbon emission reduction in Multnomah County. I didn't realize that it had plateaued at around 15% below 1990 levels. And this is not because folks have been sitting on their hands. In the city of Portland, Multnomah County, and even the state of Oregon, because there have been a couple of decades of climate planning. So can we talk a little bit about that? Do we know why?
Yeah, definitely. And there's a number of different factors, and there is a success story in there, but there's also a real warning. And so, you're correct that over the past few years, emissions have plateaued at about 15% below 1990 levels. And, the story underneath that is that per capita, so per person, carbon emissions have actually been declining, and we're 38% below 1990 levels right now, which is, it's a great success story. But overall emissions are rising. And so part of that is folks moving to Portland, right? There's more people here. But another and kind of really important part of that is that our transportation emissions are rising, right? And so we're seeing that currently transportation emissions are 8% over 1990 levels, and they are the single largest contributor to local carbon emissions in Portland.
And by transportation, what do you mean by that?
So it's both, it's gasoline in cars, it's diesel in construction equipment, it's, our transit system. And so it's a number of different things. And in terms of kind of, why they're rising, it's the population increase, right? There's just more cars on the road.
Well, now that you mention it, I remember seeing that the emissions from construction were actually quite high.
Yep, and that's the other point, right?
Yeah.
Increased economic activity is great for our community in terms of economic development.
Right.
But it is a real contributor to carbon emissions.
Exactly.
And part of that is captured in transportation, and so that's the other factor we're seeing that.
And with more people and the city becoming more, I don't want to say spread out, because not compared to like a Phoenix or the Twin Cities, what I have, familiarity with. But, people are going further from one place to another, whether it be home or job or running errands. So with more people, there's more single occupant vehicles and that sort of thing.
Yep, exactly.
And so are there, actually, I'm going to get on that later now because I don't want to jump ahead of myself.
Yeah.
But the other thing, and again, this is something you touched upon, the transportation emissions are increasing, currently 8% over 1990 levels. And I saw that and I was like, wow. It's disheartening, yet, what you said is that individually it's lower, but with more and more people, it really adds up.
Yeah, and it points to the fact that we need to do more, right? And we need to take different actions. So I don't know if this is a tangent, but kind of going back to the approach of centering equity in the way we're approaching climate action, centering frontline communities. So, one of the strategies we've long used to address transportation emissions is increasing transit ridership, right? Getting people out of single-use vehicles into more efficient forms of transportation. We've historically looked at infrastructure changes. And we continue to do that, and it continues to make a difference, right?
Right.
The Roselanes project is currently looking at how do we get buses just, reduce congestion.
Right.
Bus-only lanes.
Just even like down here on Madison. That's Madison, right? Right.
Yep. There's the new lane.
Which is fantastic.
It is. And so these things are important. But the other kind of factor in that is that, we build the infrastructure and yet there still may be barriers for people taking the bus, right?
And it's and not everybody can. And I get that. I'm fortunate that I can bike or walk and use transit to get to my places of employment. But my husband, who works we're in Southeast Portland to Aloha. That's not something that he can do.
Exactly. And so, I think the question needs to be, not how can we get more people on the bus? And this is something my colleague at the Bureau of Planning Sustainability likes to say, but, why aren't people taking the bus? What would make people feel safe on the bus, right? And kind of taking this approach of looking at the people that have the biggest challenges to bus ridership, addressing those, and that makes it easier for everyone. So kind of taking this equity approach to our transportation interventions as well.
So we have, before we touch upon the declaration, we kind of skimmed over just a few of the resolutions in this draft. And maybe I'm jumping the gun with this question, but what does this do? It's not, I was explaining to somebody that I was having this interview, and the person asked me, is this a new law? Is this a new policy? What does that mean for residents? And I guess, like I said, maybe I'm jumping the gun, but what does the declaration do? What does it signal to other people in city governments who are planning things?
Right. Yeah. So I think signal is a good word. So it really signals and it outlines the commitment and the principles that city council and city bureaus are taking to approaching climate action. One thing it really concretely does is it directs the establishment of this governance structure, this collaborative governance structure between the city, the county, and community partners to update our climate action plan, to kind of identify the next set of priority actions to address climate change. And so it is the outline of kind of the approach and the process we'll be taking forward to address the climate emergency.
Before I jump into the declarations, the Q that I mentioned, because it's A through Q on the resolutions.
Yeah.
This is kind of seems like the building block from what everything else comes from. It says, whereas the climate emergency is an existential threat to our community and economy, and combating it will require government agencies, businesses, and residents to challenge the status quo and take bold steps to meet the Portland's carbon reduction goals and transition to a just and equitable city. That lays out a lot just in that, I guess it is just one sentence. And so it really sets the stage for how to move forward.
Yeah, I would say if there's a thesis to the climate emergency declaration, that could be it. It's setting the stage. It's also a recognition that this needs to be a collaborative effort. Right. Addressing the climate emergency will take action, certainly more action on the part of the government, but also individuals and organizations and businesses. And we need to do it differently. We need to change the status quo to really make the changes we need to do.
Yeah, I mean, these are definitely intentions and strong intentions in many ways from reading all this. And so I strongly encourage people to read that part. And now let's dive into the declarations. And again, I'm not going to mention all of them. There were a couple that stood out to me. One of them is Portland will seek to support and advance climate justice and climate action initiatives that are led by the community, especially frontline communities and youth from frontline communities. So is this going to be like an ongoing process in which somebody from the city will have, I don't want to say regular or even semi-regular, but ongoing discussions about what is important to these communities and how and what they're facing?
Yes, very much so. Yeah. So, one of the other declarations in there or resolutions in there is around this establishment of a governance structure. So this ongoing, and it's deliberately not kind of defining what that governance structure looks like, right? There's going to be a process of defining that collaboratively with community groups. But that governance structure will be where community groups and the city are coming together to outline priorities and really centering the priorities of frontline communities.
Yeah. And the youth is another thing that was highlighted. Be it further resolved that Portland will pursue partnerships with schools and youth-serving organizations to support a youth-led summit on climate in 2020. I mean, as a mother of two teenagers, one of them participated in the climate strike. And there were a lot of kids very serious and very passionate about it.
Right. Yeah, it's been incredible. I mean, the
Yeah.
leadership of students and just youth generally on climate action, and they really, they will be the ones that face the consequences of the actions that we take today. And so that particular, the city's commitment to pursuing partnerships to support this youth-led climate summit, that was actually in response to a specific ask that youth organizations had of Mayor Wheeler, and I think it was actually probably from the climate strike maybe that your child participated in, but they wanted a youth climate action summit, and so we're just starting those conversations with kind of partners, Portland Public Schools, with youth organizations to understand really what they want to get out of that and how we can support. But it's a commitment to supporting that opportunity for engagement and capacity building for youth around climate.
And there are a lot of visions when it comes to these declarations. Just reading over them, you mentioned the new target of achieving at least 50% reduction in carbon emissions. That is certainly a bold target. Prioritizing and advancing policies and investments to reduce carbon emissions. I mean, there are things that that the mayor's office definitely has in mind when it comes to this declaration. It's not just a piece of paper. These are goals that he has in mind.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and in December, he made a series of commitments focused on city actions, right, to advance climate action. And one of those was in kind of response to the question you asked earlier around how are we supporting these community-led initiatives. So one of the actions the mayor came up, specifically was directing the Bureau of Planning Sustainability and the Bureau of Development Services to look at potential permitting and code barriers to Portland Clean Energy Fund.
I did see that in there.
Yeah, and so that's kind of one of the ways we as the city can support community-led projects, right? So the kinds of projects that we expect to see coming out of PSF. How can we make sure that when those dollars are going out the door, those projects can happen?
Right. And what do you see, or what does the office see as items in here that I haven't touched upon that that the mayor and the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability are really passionate about?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that's interesting to highlight is there is I'm not remembering the exact number here. But there's two places where we talk about how land use and zoning policy really is a climate action strategy, and that's something. It's a priority both for the mayor's office and for the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, which does include both planning and sustainability, to really integrate those things. So in the whereas section, it talks about how displacement.
I just saw that
exactly right has a connection with climate change, right?
Absolutely,
and frontline communities bearing the brunt of climate impacts, partly as a result of displacement. And so how, the mayor has directed an anti-displacement strategy for the city, the development of the strategy, and that is a key part of taking an equitable approach to climate change.
Right. Because I have the luxury of having that choice of how I get to work, whereas others who are displaced from their homes, the choices start to dwindle.
Right. And then, similarly, strategies to expand transit, but also, increase development that is close to transit. So this transit-oriented development strategy is another way to kind of marry planning and climate action.
Mm-hmm. Well, I see number 20 of the 20 declarations. Be it further resolved that the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability will update City Council on the progress to implement these directives before the end of 2020.
Yeah.
So they definitely are getting their feet held under the fire to make sure that
there's a lot to be done. I mean, it's really exciting.
It's pretty aggressive.
Yeah, but certainly.
Well, let me ask you this. I mean, and you may not even have the answer to this, but it popped up in my head. I mean, we're looking at an election year. So what happens to this declaration should we have somebody else? I mean, once the declaration is set, it's sort of set, and there's not much that perhaps the next mayor can do about it.
Yeah, I mean, we are planning to bring the resolution to council on April 22nd, which is the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. And, City Council, if City Council adopts the resolution at that time, you're right. It's on the books. And, my hope is, though, that regardless of, how much turnover there may be on City Council, that this is a shared value for Portlanders, really.
I think it really is.
I think, we all recognize.
We haven't gotten this far. We haven't had decades of movement just by government alone. It's been led by the community members.
Exactly. And that energy and that incredible leadership and knowledge and experience will continue to be there. And so, the city government will continue to work together with community to address those priorities.
So this will be posted on Tuesday, which gives people a few days to comment. Have you or anybody else had a chance to look at the comments that have already rolled in? Because it's a couple of weeks old now. This declaration has been out there.
Yeah, I have gone through the first kind of group of comments that we've received online, and I've also had a number of conversations with community members who've reached out to myself and my colleagues at the Bureau of Planning Sustainability. We've gotten over 100 comments online so far.
Great.
And it's really, it's fascinating. It's been a broad kind of range of comments. So both a lot of really great comments specific to the resolution, suggestions for revisions to how can we make the language even more inclusive.
Right.
Folks pointing out they'd like to see more focus on adaptation as well as mitigation.
Tell me, what do you mean by that?
So, not only reducing carbon emissions, but how do we make our community more resilient to the impacts of climate change that we are already seeing and we will still expect to see, right? Because we're locked into a certain amount of that. So kind of bringing that out, more to the forefront. Some folks wanting to see more specificity in terms of policies in here. And, it was a deliberate choice actually to keep it broad.
I was going to ask you.
Yeah. And so, when we first started kind of working at the Bureau level on what a climate emergency declaration looked like, as I touched on before, it was much more specific. But, because what we want to do here is to pivot the city towards a different way of climate action planning that's more community focused and working together with community, we didn't want to be predefining those, what policies would be a priority. And so this action instead directs that work of, how we're going to be defining those priorities.
Well, and oftentimes things come up that are out of your control. And so to have specific things written down and then not be able to meet them because of, something that happens that, then you perhaps, and I'm not saying that this would happen, but perhaps you're so focused on that goal that you lose track of other things that can be done.
Right. So it's a balancing act.
It has to be somewhat fluid.
Yeah, wanting to be really clear about our goals and our priorities and the general areas that we're going to be focusing on, but not too specific about the actions also because, it's already a long resolution,
it is.
20 declarations. And so if we were going to be exhaustive, it would be just too much for us to put in one document.
And so have there been any comments that have been surprising or just someone going, wow, I had not thought of that?
Yeah. We've had, I don't know if surprising is the word, but, when I was talking about the full range, we have had a lot of comments that don't think that, climate work should be a priority for the city, right? So either because they're concerned that resources should be put towards other community priorities like homelessness, or some folks just thinking that human-caused climate change either doesn't exist or isn't a priority for action at the city level, and obviously the city of Portland does feel it is a really important.
Right, this declaration in and of itself is. Right.
That. So there's been, a handful of comments about that. And then actually the other interesting thing that I found is a lot of people just took it taking it as an opportunity to comment about the city's climate action work generally, right? So a lot of folks writing in particularly around, wanting to see more action on transportation, which, does fit with kind of what we're seeing. But, more protected bike lanes, more reliable bus service, getting people out of cars, things like that. And so, where it doesn't necessarily give us specific feedback on kind of how they want the declaration to look, it's still actually really valuable for us to continue to have a pulse on, what Portlanders care about in terms of climate action and what people are wanting the city to pay attention to. Yeah.
And besides the fact that people can comment now for a few more days, will there come a time, do you think, and maybe this hasn't even been thought out, but once the declaration comes out in April, and then there's the 8 months before reporting has to be done, will there be opportunities for people to go, you know what, I want to be involved somehow in this, or will it stick with just the folks that have already been sort of giving feedback to BPS?
I would say it's more expansive. Yeah. So, in the establishment of this governance structure, it's going to be that it's a process by which we're going to be working with partners to figure out, who will be at the table with us, and how can other people who are interested in climate action participate in that, right? And so I don't, know exactly what that's going to look like, right? We've just started conversations on that. But yeah, I think, I'm envisioning a process by which we can really be engaging the community more regularly in an institutionalized way and give people, both an opportunity to learn about what's happening, but also to be a part of the process.
Well, it's not going away.
Exactly.
We've got a lot of work that has to be done. And so, yeah, it's a fluid situation in which, who knows what it looks like in a year even. When BPS was putting this together, did they reach out to other communities around the country and around the world who have also put together declarations?
I'm not sure kind of on the staff level. I know they certainly were looking at the declarations. I don't know if they kind of chatted with folks, but certainly reading through other cities' declarations. And, a lot of the language, probably has similar themes, right? Because a lot of communities and cities are dealing with the same challenges.
And being aggressive on trying to see what can be done at a city level.
Right, yeah. But, we really did want to do something different with Portland. And so I'm proud that, we took the extra time to work with communities to come up with something that really is unique to Portland and really what, the mayor and, the city feels that we need right now, right?
Yeah. So again, strongly urge folks to go to kink.fm on this podcast, number 59. We will have a link to not only this draft, but also the letter from the mayor that he put out talking about it, the reason behind it, and going forward. And so people can get some more information there as well. But definitely take a look at the draft of the climate emergency declaration and give your feedback. And anything else that I didn't touch upon that you want to add?
I think you covered it, but I do want to impress that we really do want to get folks' feedback. And, this is a draft. We wanted to put the draft out there and give folks enough time to comment, but there will be, improvements that we can make. And so I'm really looking forward to getting more input and how we can continue to refine and improve this. So it's a meaningful, it's a bold, and it's a just climate emergency declaration for Portland.
And it's one in which community members can help shape.
Yeah, exactly.
Because I think that's important. Thank you so much, Amanda, for coming in today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining me for my conversation with Amanda Watson, Senior Policy Advisor for Portland Mayor Ted Wheeler. If you've missed any of the previous podcasts, you can find them at our website at kink.fm. Be sure to like and subscribe to Talking Trash, a Green Tips podcast, on iTunes, Google Play, or wherever you're listening. Talking Trash is a podcast series featuring people in business, government, and nonprofits, and sometimes just regular folks in the Portland area and around Oregon who are having an impact in the world of sustainability.